speak to you.
私はもう少しこっちが先ですので、こうすると。
And also, I will edit,
Yep.
and then I will send it to you.
Yep.
And then after the permission from you, I will translate it into Japanese. So we can actually
Perfect.
work later.
Perfect. Yeah.
If you don't like it.
I mean, in general, or I was going to say, if there are any words that or terminologies that don't quite translate to Japanese, just stop me and then we can be really clear, because some of the issues, even in the European languages, just don't translate. There is no word in Dutch or German for rent seeking. You know what rent seeking is? So to create an opportunity, there is the producer, there is the consumer, you stand in the middle and you create an extra economic rent. Now, this is exactly the business model of Uber, and yet I discovered that in the Germanic languages there is no word for it. And this is very interesting, because the reason there is a word for it in English is because of Adam Smith. And Smith says, we have the rent seekers, those who are, and yet the Germans, in an entire 200-year history of post-Smith economics, didn't bother to create a similar term. But so maybe in Japanese it's even more challenging. We will find out.
Very different languages.
Yeah, we'll find out.
I think that's going to be fine. So we can talk about it like that.
I know nothing about Japan. I've never been to Japan, I'm sorry. I know a bit about Japan. And we can talk about the fiscal dynamics and the quantitative easing. I'm confident on that. But the politics I don't really understand, and I don't know how advanced the commons, the commons movements are in Japan.
So one main aim of this book is like, in Japan the social movements are very weak.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as Occupy,
No.
or Sanders, or Common, etc. So I'd like to kind of introduce how in other countries those new movements, power expression, why it's kicking off everywhere.
Yeah,
except Japan.
and I think it's really important because now we've seen just this week those 20 new members of the US Congress going to Congress.
Right.
They are incredibly popular all over the world. Your audience will soon hear of Ocasio-Cortez if they haven't already. Yeah. So it's going to be good. Well, start whenever you want.
Okay, so can we start? Okay, so let me begin with introducing your book into the Japanese audience, because not everyone has read your book yet, even it's published in Japanese. So I personally think that your book is very revolutionary. And
Good.
It's a really new stage of the left thinking, because 10 years ago many postmodern thinkers were very pessimistic, like Frederick James said.
Yeah.
It's easy to think the end of the world rather than think about capitalism and so on. But now we are in a clear crisis of capitalism, crisis of democracy, crisis of ecology, and I think that now you wrote this book, Post-Capitalism, that really opens up new possibilities of exploring alternatives to neoliberal order. So, could you explain sort of the general summary of your book, especially with reference to three important changes: the reduction of the need for work, and then corroding the market ability to form price correctly, and then the increasing social cooperation.
Okay, so I was a journalist covering the financial crisis. I expected the financial crisis, but I didn't expect it. I didn't predict the moment. I didn't predict the form it would take. But it was obvious that there was too much leverage in the global system, too much speculation, and that this would end in a classic Karl Marx Capital Volume 3 financial crisis. Now, as that crisis unfolded, it became clear that it wasn't a normal crisis. I mean, for one thing, it was massive, it was huge, it was catastrophic. And the state all over the world and the central banks had to step in and break every rule that they had set for 30 years. And so I said to myself, this is an era-ending crisis. This is a crisis that will end the era, because now we have a set of rules, embodied even in things like the Constitution of the European Union, which can no longer be followed. And we have an elite and an administrative class that doesn't know really what to do. And I wanted to try and create mental tools to understand that crisis. Now, one very useful mental tool was created by Richard Koo, who is the Nomura chief economist, and he said it's a crisis of leverage, and therefore we face a 10-year depression during which the world will deleverage. But it was quickly obvious that there would not be deleveraging, and what I mean by deleveraging is reducing the amount of debt to GDP, household debt, company debt, and government debt. Instead, as you know, the two responses to the crisis were to, first of all, use state intervention to save the banks, thereby underpinning the entire global financial system with an implicit state guarantee. Then to print money using quantitative easing, and then using the quantitative easing and the revised banking regulations to encourage greater leverage. And so instead of deleveraging, we added $57 trillion worth of debt to the global economy since 2008. Now, in that decade, I started to ask myself very quickly how to frame this. If we're seeing the end of an era crisis, how do you frame an end of an era crisis? And the first port of call, the first destination, was to, in the book called Meltdown, written very quickly after the crisis, to use the Kondratiev wave cycle as a mental frame. And the Kondratiev wave cycle has to be understood as being disrupted. That is, we have an old era dying, but a new takeoff point, which is very clearly there in the technology, unable to take off because the old system is kept alive artificially by quantitative easing, by state intervention into the banking system. And therefore, we have the phenomenon of zombie companies, companies that cannot go bust. If you wanted to be very controversial, you could describe Japan as a zombie economy, which is, it has a booming consumption, it has real innovation in robotics and engineering, and yet it has a debt 250% of its GDP, and is the economy that has overtly used quantitative easing the most aggressively. Now, so before coming to the explanation, I think it's worth noting that while the official mainstream economics world was still treating this as a crisis of deleveraging, leverage and deleverage, and therefore you solve it by financial regulation, state investment, and then you create quantitative easing as a bridge to the next take-off point. This is the overt metaphor used by the central bankers. In Shanghai in 2016, Mark Carney called this a bridge. And he said, the question is quantitative easing a bridge or is it a pier? That is it a thing which ends in a drop into the sea? I look at it like this. Quantitative easing kept the old neoliberal capitalist system alive, but you can't keep an ideology alive through quantitative easing. You have to be able to wake up in the morning as an ordinary person on the street and say, how does my kid get a university education? How do I become richer than I was last year? And if the system cannot answer this, quantitative easing doesn't answer it. Okay. Now, while they were trying to frame the crisis as a normal crisis, many of us tried to understand its roots. And for me, obviously, the Kondratiev wave, the disrupted Kondratiev wave, takes you so far because it poses the first serious question. How, in 250 years of industrial capitalism, did we end up in a situation where we have the technology for a takeoff, but the social relations cannot allow the takeoff? And that's the starting point, for me, of the post-capitalism thesis. I began to read, you'll talk to Cernacek, Rifkin is globally famous, but in fact, when I started the book, neither of these two books had come out. The inspiration was Drucker, because Drucker's book, Post-Capitalist Society, very clearly says that, it even says something like this, information technology is so different that it will feel like we're kind of breathing oxygen, high pure oxygen for a few decades, and then it will hit us that the present system can't go on and we need to change. Now, Paul Romer, who Drucker had read Drucker died just after Romer wrote the Endogenous Technological Change. Romer, I think, is the crucial economist. And I went back to Romer and tried to understand the significance of that. Now, it's very interesting that Romer was sidelined by mainstream economics because they didn't really understand the significance of what he had to say. We see Summers and DeLong in 2001 try and get their heads around this issue of information technology creates, let's summarize it like this, and this is almost like the first thesis of post-capitalism. Information technology creates use value or utility on such a vast scale that it delinks from the exchange value in Marxist terms, or inputs that, if we use normal economic terms, it delinks from the inputs. It creates utility on a vast and exponential scale, and the present structure of capitalism cannot contain it. Now, my contribution to this emerging debate about can there be a post-capitalist economy, I think consists, first of all, of linking it to the crisis. Because many of the people had thought, I noticed that we were living in an era of technological euphoria and socio-economic doom. And nobody wanted to link the two things. My theory allows us to link the technological euphoria to the doom by saying, and this is the kind of almost like the first foundation stone of my thinking, by saying the 2008 crisis, and in fact the 2001 crisis and the Asian crisis really are advanced warnings that there is not enough value in the future economy to repay the debt we need to keep the present economy moving. And to say that is so heretical that almost nobody in the official world of capitalism can allow for this to be true. That if a central banker said, "Look, guys, we've assembled, 150 to 200% of GDP as debt," that's unprecedented outside extreme. I mean, Second World War, it was around about 100, and then it subsided quickly. It's unprecedented, the levels of debt to GDP. We seem to need this to be happening in order for just a normal capitalism with very low historic levels of growth just to keep going. But these debts will only be met if there is a massive outburst of value creation in the mid-21st century, or if we write them off. And if we write them off, households, companies, states, banks will go bust. So we're not going to write them off. So all we're doing now is pumping ourselves with oxygen. QE is one form of it, fiscal stimulus is another, endless pretend and extend in terms of debt repayment is another. The real truth is there's not enough value in the information economy to deliver on these debts. There may be enough, it doesn't mean it's catastrophe, because there may be enough development going on in the global south, enough Chinese households who have an internet connection and a refrigerator, and then in Africa, and then in South America. Yeah, there's enough. You could keep going that way, extensive growth, but you're not going to solve the problem of the debt because there's not enough value created by information technology. In fact, information technology, another way of putting the so-called zero marginal cost thesis, is it destroys value. So that's the foundation stone is to stick the two events together. The technological euphoria, which is justified, and the crisis, which is about more than 10 years' worth of bad borrowing. It's about the fact that we create an economy that can't flourish without creating money and creating debt.
Mm-hmm. But it also, the new technologies also open up the new possibilities for the new society that cannot be contained with the current mode of production.
No, I mean, look, let's put it another way. I could have made a lot more money with this book if I left out the first chapter, which says that the current system is broken, it's crisis-ridden, there's going to be a breakup, I mean, it even says on page 3 that unless we retreat from globalization and neoliberalism, and abandon neoliberalism and do less globalization, there will be a breakup of the global system. Now, 3 years later, this is proved correct, unfortunately. I think the Chinese-American trade war, the paralysis of the WTO, the paralysis of the UN, all the geopolitical tensions between Europe and America and Russia are examples of exactly this. We're seeing the breakup. Brexit is the number one example. We're seeing the breakup of the global system. But if I'd have just written a book that says technology will produce a certain kind of society, it would have been very popular. And in fact, this indeed is my critique of all the other writers, that they are they have uncomplicated models of social change. No, in terms of the technology, the thesis is that information technology is different to all other technologies. Now, however, and this is something I write about in the next book, and I've been speaking about to audiences since the book came out. Information technology is just a machine, in the sense that we face the need to demystify machines continually. Galileo, in 1603, writes the first tract on mechanics to demystify what a machine does. His contemporaries thought machines defied the laws of nature, and Galileo says, no, a machine enacts the law of nature. Adam Smith says, machines produce no value. And this is the great contribution of the Labour theory of value. Smith visited places where machines were being made in Scotland and realised that the machine themselves added nothing to the economy, only the work of the people creating them. So this is an act of demystification. And we now need to demystify what information technology does. Because we're surrounded, especially in Europe, in the European intellectual sphere, by these concepts of immaterial labour, cognitive capital, intangible assets, etc. These concepts are largely bullshit. The information technology is indeed only a machine. But in South Korea, in August 2018, I met an engineer who was working on a silicon wafer with 1 trillion switches. The one in your pocket on your cell phone has maybe 3 billion. The one on a Pentium 4 computer had 1 million. A machine with 1 trillion switches, 9 nanometers thick, 9 atoms thick, is the most powerful machine. Lottie, come here.
Lottie, come here.
Come here, no.
Sorry.
Where's Jane? Where's Jane? Where's Jane? Come on. Lottie, where's Jane?
This way. So
Thank you.
So sorry.
She's good.
It's just straight ahead.
So, I mean, you've got a machine with 1 trillion switches is a different kind of machine, because what it does is that it creates utility, it creates knowledge, it creates data on a scale that is exponential. And as Deloitte says, and as I reference in the book, it may be that in several sectors the information technology's impact on productivity is exponential forever. I mean, in other words, you are very quickly into the realms of freedom. So we have to try to honestly address what the impact of exponentially improved productivity, machines that can reproduce themselves. Marx famously imagined it for nothing. Marx says the ideal machine is a machine that costs nothing and lasts forever. Well, software is a machine that costs nothing to reproduce and lasts forever as long as it's not obsolescent. We have to begin to ask, what is the impact of that on this thing, capitalism? But here's where you come up with the first problem. Capitalism, mainstream economics, has no concept of capitalism. It doesn't recognise itself as a time-limited entity. When they think about pre-capitalist modes of production, capitalist economists think about as if they are capitalist but not good enough. So they look at pharaonic Egypt, the Egypt of the pyramids, and they see markets, and they think, oh good, there were markets. And then they see slaves, and they think, oh well, not so good. They could have had less slaves and more market. They have a completely normative, ahistorical view. Whereas for us, people like me coming from the Marxist tradition, we always understand that modes of production are time limited, and that most modes of production that there have been in human history have had a beginning and a middle and an end. And the more we understand about economic history, the more interesting that becomes. For example, for example, most of the early Marxist work on ancient societies or on feudalism has been completely replaced by much more concrete, good historic explanations. But these explanations only deepen the fact that after a while, the mode of wealth reproduction runs into the problem that the technology has moved on from it. This is the thing that Marx is talking about in the famous 1853 preface, the preface to a critique of political economy. Now, this is a very important mental tool that the mainstream economics doesn't have, because they should be asking, what's happened to neoliberalism? That's the first question. It's a time-limited era within capitalism, lasting 30 or 40 years. Why did it end? Is the obvious question. But they don't want to answer that question. What they want to, the question they want to ask is, how do we keep it going? And the next bigger question is, given neoliberalism was such an unusual period in world history, the fact of it ending, does that mean we get an even more aggressive and expansive and technologically progressive period, or not? Because that's the other thing that being a historical materialist allows you to do. It allows you to understand that there can be periods of collapse and long-term stagnation, as well as periods of aggressive growth. And again, mainstream economics has no models for these things. So I was able to say, okay, let me summarize the thesis. If you want, you can cut the entire interview down to this.
Sorry. If you could sometimes look at her.
I will do, yeah.
Yeah, then I can, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll do this. So let me summarize the thesis. Information technology is different in the following 4 ways. It collapses the cost of production. This is what Rifkin calls the zero marginal cost effect, but Roma also pointed it out. The reproduction cost of information goods tends towards zero very quickly. This, in turn, creates challenges for profit realization, because in the modern kind of self-understanding of capitalism, profits are generated by production cost plus. Okay, so it erodes market. It erodes very quickly all the circumstantial means through which individual players in the economy create profit. That's number one. Number two, it delinks work from wages, and it allows the possibility of rapid, and I don't use the term decisive automation. This is a term I don't use in the book, but in the next book I will talk about, we are facing the possibility of decisive automation. That is an automation in which, good example, I, as a young man, worked in a factory where I was setting the tools I wasn't setting, I was using the tools in a press, in a metal press. And above us we had the ones who set the tools in, because they had to be accurately placed, because you don't want mistakes. And then in the next door we had men who made the tools. And somewhere in an office was a man designing the tools on an analogue sheet of paper. Okay, now we know that every part of this process has been automated. The metal press is now automated, it's robotic, but it uses lasers to ensure a far greater degree of accuracy than our hands and eyes could do. We were simply the feedback mechanism. Now it has a feedback mechanism. Okay, the tool making is also automated. The robot makes the tool much more accurately. But this is the interesting thing. Now we have automated tool design. I know of examples in China where the client says, we need a range of tools between X and Y to do this job, and instead of individual human beings sit down to do them, a computer calls up solutions. Now, in other words, the machine has, within a lifetime, eradicated not simply human hand-eye actions, but human creativity. And this is superb. This is great. So, but this is point two. What it allows us to do is blur work and leisure. Because every single one of us is carrying a device which allows us to work and have fun at the same time. And the decisive automation possibilities are there. The third thing is the creation of new utility through network effects. For 200 years, economics struggled with the idea of the externalities. The thing that happens external to the bargain between me and you. If you're an energy factory and I am a woman with a washing line, you've created this cloud of dust, it lands on my washing. Somebody should sort this out, but it isn't captured in the energy bill. Okay, so we create a tax on the energy company. That's good. That's how you deal with a negative externality. But once we start to have vast positive externalities, which are created by network effects, the question is not how to punish them, but who should own them. And what capitalism cannot do, in a priori, is allocate the ownership of the network effects. Because when my dad went into the factory in the 1960s, worked for a certain length of time, got wages, he wasn't surprised that the owner of the factory received a profit. This was natural. But it is disputable who should own the data created when millions of us interact. It's not obvious that I should own it or that Mark Zuckerberg should own it. It's not obvious. That's the third decisive thing that information technology does. And the fourth thing related to that is it democratizes information. In the sense that if we discover something wrong with the electronic copy of my book, that's on Amazon Kindle, a misspelling, it can be corrected tomorrow, and everybody can download a new version. Or if we discover something, a new improvement to, say, an internet standard, it's downloaded the next day. This is incredibly useful. So let's reiterate: the falling production costs, blurring work and leisure, network effects, and democratized information are four completely new economic, let's call them techno-economic impacts that capitalism has never dealt with before. It has mental compartments to put them in, but they are no longer relevant. And that's where the possibility of post-capitalism arises from. Now, the need for it, which throws forward maybe to another question, but the need for it arises because instead of creating in an uncomplicated way a new system, these four impacts have in fact created a dysfunctional form of capitalism. One which is reliant on boom and bust, one which is reliant on QE, borrowing and state intervention, and which at a structural level, let's look at the responses. What's the response to the zero marginal cost effect? Huge monopolies to push prices beyond the cost of production. What's the response to the possibility of automation? Is to create millions of precarious jobs that don't need to exist. What David Graeber calls bullshit jobs. What's the response to network effects? Is to create vast rent-seeking business models. So you capture the network effect, and then the profit becomes a form of economic rent. It's extracted. What's the response to data democratization? Complete asymmetry of information. And you mentioned Frederick Jameson, who said it was easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The concrete form of this is to say it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine Facebook revealing what the algorithm is that is acting on our brains. If it revealed it, it would no longer be Facebook. So there cannot be data democracy. There has to be vast asymmetry. And before I let you ask me another question, I'm going to say one other thing. If we then enumerate these four things: monopoly, bullshit jobs, rent-seeking business models, and vast asymmetries, every one of them, in, let's call it, the Smithian capitalist world, should be eradicated. Because Because classic economics believes none of them can survive markets. And therefore, what kind of capitalism we are creating is a systemically anti-competitive one, where Facebook must be a single monopoly, where nobody can create a skilled job, where Uber and Airbnb and others are being created by SoftBank, which is as you know, a Japanese Saudi Arabian project, which basically funnels tax, billions which have evaded tax, or avoided tax, let's put it that properly, from the offshore system into the real world, into non-profit making companies in order to disrupt the system. This is one of the most anti-social forms of capitalism you can imagine. And as regards the asymmetry, I think the tech industry alone spends more than $1 billion every year in Brussels with one purpose: to avoid regulation. To avoid the European citizen being allowed to have sight of what is going on in the algorithms. So to summarise the argument, these 4 new features create a dysfunctional capitalism, and that what those of us who are critical of it must go beyond the critique of it's over-indebted or it's badly regulated. It can't survive is the critique, and it must be replaced first by a form of capitalism that can survive these questions, and second by a transition towards a different mode of production.